Welcome to a tutorial video on Twine 2.3. In this video, I'm going to talk about the global window.story object as part of Snowman 1.3. Snowman doesn't have built-in macros, but does have access to JavaScript and jQuery. Snowman also provides one of two major global objects for accessing parts of a story, window.story. So story is a global object we can access as part of window that contains information about the story itself. And it's one of two that are particularly important when working with the story format Snowman. We see an example of that right here. We see we can access the name of the story, the ID of the starting passage, as well as the program used to create the story, Twine. And this will make more sense when we go look at the code itself. Like with Harlow and SugarCube, two other story formats that come as part of Twine 2.3, it is possible to access information about the passages in the story. This is the window.story interface. So we can access not only the name of the story, the starting passage, the name of the program that created it, as well as the name of the passages within the story itself. And we see an example of that right here. We see through a window to a story, arrays of information, and three other passages that we haven't looked at yet. Like with the other story formats, there are not just properties and values, but functions too. We can also do things, not just access information, but also run different functions. To get information about a passage, we can use window.story.passage, and then look for a named passage to get back a passage object. Like I said right here, the name of the passage in the story, or directly use window.story.render to parse and return the content of a passage. This can be very useful. We want to immediately include another passage. So while we can, of course, look for a passage and get it back and then do something with it, like look at its source, or maybe render it from there, we can also directly render it using window.story.render to immediately render, that is, run any code, any inclusion of a underscore template within that, and then do something with it. And we see examples of that right here. And here's the content, and then the name of the passage using window.story.passage and its own content extra text. Let's look at this code. So we see right here the use of arrays of information about the story. I mentioned that window.story gives us access to different things. This right here runs through the passage list. Notice we're looking at window.story.passage, which is an array of all passages. And we're using the JavaScript functionality. Again, I mentioned at the beginning, we have access to JavaScript as well as jQuery. This is a jQuery use of JavaScript function called each, which allows us to do a for each type thing by going through different items within a data structure. In this case, we're going through the array window.story.passages. For each then, as long as its index is not 0, we're looking at the name of the passage and then its passage name, getting each time the object representing that passage as we go through the property passages as part of the global window.story object. So we see we can look at all of the passages. Coming back then through a window to a story, we can also see we can get property information about the story, looking at the window.story object and some of its properties. And these are just three of them here. Notice we're looking at window.story.name. This was the name of the story. Window.story.startPassage, whatever the start passage is. And window.story.creator, whatever program was used to create this story. And in this case, it was Twine, which is what we're using right here. And we could overwrite this if we were using another program. So we see an example of this where we're including a script tag. We're running jQuery within this with JavaScript, and we're working with the window.story global object, one of two again that we can do things with. So we looked at name, start passage, and creator as just three of several different properties we can access as part of window.story. Moving back over to functions then, we see we can also use functions as part of that window.story global object. We can use render to immediately render the contents, that is, turn it into HTML, save that, and immediately use jQuery to change to HTML content of an element with the ID of log. We see we have an element with the ID of log right here, and we can immediately put that content in there. We can also get a passage object by using the passage function to get a named passage. In this case, we're looking at unconnected. Unconnected is over here, extra text. Coming back to this, we say, okay, go find this passage with this name, We're using window.story global object, using its function, getting a passage object, passage details are saved right here. Then, as part of this right here, we're saying, okay, go find an element called with an ID of passage details. Passage details is right here. Then we say change its HTML content. Then we're looking at the passage details name and passage details source. Two properties as part of all passages. Name and source, there's also tags as well. So we can look at those properties and do stuff with them. So in this video, I've covered very quickly ways of working with the window.story global object. It has its own properties, things like the name, the starting passage, ID, as well as what created, and a number of other properties as well. It also has some existing functions like passage and render. Passage allows us to go look up a passage object representing a named passage. We say, hey, go look for this passage, and we give it a name, and it returns an object representing that passage. And also window.story.render, which allows us to immediately render the contents, run it, if it includes any underscore template functionality, to translate that or do anything with it, and then store the HTML content it would have returned, and then we can do something with that as well. So we can either directly get a passage, an object representing a passage, or we can immediately render it to get its source equivalent. These are two different functions that are part of the window story global object, as well as its existing properties I've also covered in this video. But there's a lot of extra functionality, and I encourage people to go look at the documentations to see what experiments and what fun, interesting stories they can create in Snowman using this global object. Thanks for watching.